hard, even though I create state policy, to look at the work that I'm doing and imagine how it will manifest in local ways. And so one of the things I did last year was I introduced this bill, SB 679, which would create the Los Angeles Housing Authority. It is not a novel idea. There is an authority just like this for the Bay Area. Okay, so we just decided to mimic it. And so we're getting all this pushback from legislators actually within Los Angeles County and also folks across the state who don't think we should have this. And really, 679 would create an agency that focuses on renter protections, that focuses on the preservation of existing housing stock, and that will allow for the financing from private and public funds to build 100% affordable housing. That is worth an applause. And that can be with developers, it can be with community land trusts, it can be with faith-based communities and churches and synagogues. It is agnostic in terms of who the groups are, as long as you are committed to 100% affordable housing. We know that we have a problem here in the county. We know that we need a different kind of solution. And we also know that we have 88 small cities with Los Angeles City and the county that kind of talk like this at cross purposes. And if you walk out of your house, if you walk down the street, you see that we don't have any more time for cross-purpose conversations.
That's right.
No longer can we place blame. We have just got to roll up our sleeves and focus on the solutions at hand. The other thing I've really been focused on is finding money to create community energy hubs. Because while we are talking about environmentalism, while we are talking about the climate crisis, while we are talking about state and federal and even international issues and solutions as it relates to climate change, I also believe that there is a lot of power that can be harnessed at the local level. And there are communities that have different kinds of energy needs. There are some communities that have clean water. There are other communities that don't. There are some communities that have access to land that would allow you to farm. There are other communities that don't. There are some communities that have found ways to work with CCAs or have found ways to harness natural energy. And then there are other communities that are not. And so rather than creating a solution that is one size fits all, and I don't like to compare myself to Bakersfield or the Central Valley or the Bay Area or even San Diego. And I also recognize it's probably not important to compare, it's not appropriate to compare Beverly Hills to Southgate. How can we work to create a new framework that allows us to develop and harness and share and recycle our own energy? I think it's kind of, aspirational and maybe a little hooky, but I also think that it can be done. And then the last thing I've been working on at the local level is this notion of urban farming and freedom farms. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I will say it came to me from really looking at the work that Fannie Lou Hamer did when she created Freedom Farms in the late 60s. And there is a nexus between self-sufficiency, environmentalism, healing Mother Earth, and empowerment that we never really think about. We take all of those issues in silos. And then for me, the connective tissue for all of those is our faith-based community. It's the work that's happening in our mosques, in our synagogues, in our churches. When we pray, but when we also begin to talk about service and how we activate the words that we read in ways that will create a better and more just community. And I believe that that can happen actually when you are tilling soil, because it is an incredible connection. And so I was also really just caught off guard when all of a sudden in having this conversation, I learned about the year Shemitah. And I thought, well, how appropriate is this? Because there are deeper, more spiritual relationships that even I was unaware of. as it relates to how folks who are really connected to service and spirit are also connected to land and what it means. And earlier this week, I was actually having a conversation with my seatmate, Henry Stern, and we were talking about this, and he said, I love this, because in the Jewish culture, bread is so important. And the connection between labor and land in bread is really key for us. It is the highest elevation. And the shared intimacy that comes from breaking bread, coupled with whenever we have, tough negotiations, right? We sit at a table and we break bread. Whenever we're getting ready to really sort of celebrate a real special occasion, we do it over food and bread. Whenever we're thinking about how to move freedom forward, we kind of do it at a table with bread. And so that's for me at the heart of all of this. But the undercurrent, the radicalism is, how are we also creating spaces where communities can be involved in producing something that they can sell, that they also take ownership of, and how that furthers economic self-sufficiency for so many communities, ethnic communities, communities of color, communities that, are probably under-resourced or often forgotten. And not only is it a way to sort of find dollars and recycle them in your own community, but I see it as an opportunity to bridge gaps between different ethnic and religious groups, because the spaces that I find myself in, we are all on the same path. So I'm going to stop talking because I'm looking at these two amazing people right here, and I want to get into it, and I want to learn.
So good to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the work you're doing. I want to, we were, as I said, as Melissa said, particularly excited to have you here.
Move away from me now.
Well. We were particularly excited to have you here in part because this is the Shemitah year, and so it's a time for us to think about land and about the way that the economy is tied to the land. So I want to just do a very, very quick overview of what the Shemitah year is, and then also what the Jubilee year is, and then I want to ask you a couple questions through the lens of those institutions. The Shemitah year, which we're in one of them right now, happens every 7 years, and the Torah says that every 7 years you cease all cultivation of the land, all farming, all working the land, and just let the land grow. And that is in part a recognition that nothing really belongs to you, everything belongs to God, and the land is also allowed to rest because it belongs to God. But it's also very specifically intended as a system in which all of the land becomes open to everybody, and the poor can come by and feed off of all of the growth of the land. There's no more fencing the land, that people simply eat off of the land and it belongs to everybody. So that's the Shemitah year, and the one other thing that happens during the Shemitah year is that all debts are canceled. So again, a sort of thinking about the relationship between what we do with the land and the economic state of all the members of society, and especially the most vulnerable members of society. Then the Jubilee year comes once every 7 times 7, so once every 50 years, and it's even, you use the word radicalism, it's even more, I think both of these institutions are radical institutions, and this is even more radical. Freedom is proclaimed throughout the land. Anyone who's in bondage, servitude, slavery, indentured servitude is released, and then especially significantly, in the Jubilee year, everybody returns to their ancestral homeland. So everybody kind of reclaims the land that they once owned, and everybody in that year starts again being a landowner, having property, having land to once again begin the cycle, to grow and to cultivate. So I want to ask you one question sort of Shemitah related and one question Jubilee related. And the Shemitah question is I'd just love for you to help us think through the relationship between land and cultivation of land and farming, which is something that you're thinking about, and poverty and other forms of economic entrapment and lingering kind of economic oppression. We talk about poverty and we talk about ways to address poverty, but what's the role of land and land use and farming and harvesting from land in our policy discussions around poverty?
So land is really important. And when we talk about generational wealth, and I know a lot of discussions are happening now around economic justice, some of the more uncomfortable and robust discussions in the housing space have to do with people's ability to buy homes and acquire land, because we know it is the largest asset that most families have. It's the asset that you can give to your heirs, and it's the thing that is the fastest way for folks to create and sustain generational wealth. And we also know that access to capital to get into that space is really hard, and there are communities that have been historically discriminated against and left out of those capital markets. So that's just, yes. The second thing as it relates to land and cultivation and farming is, of course, the United States has a long and sordid history with farming and sharecropping and plantations and slavery. And so once we decided that slavery was bad, we created a loophole to really allow us to continue to benefit economically off free labor. As I mentioned, Fannie Lou Hamer in the late 60s started her Freedom Farms. And this was a woman who was evicted. She lost her land, her family's land, and realized that there is a nexus between affordable housing and development, economic sustainability, and land. So between 1950 and 1964, black farmers lost 12 million acres of land across the country. During the Jim Crow era, the Department of Ag created policies that stole land from black farmers, and then also doubled down on those policies by creating new ones that would keep us from buying land. And so her response was to create Freedom Farms, and she did this with a small grant from a nonprofit organization and money from Harry Belafonte. And with that money, she bought 40 acres. No mule, but 40 acres. And really created an organization that was designed to acquire land back for African Americans who were farmers, so that they could own the land and ultimately they could own what the yield was from it. So we have a real tangible relationship to land and to farming. And the Jewish community does as well. And when you take the one thing that someone has that defines their ability to provide for their families, that is really pernicious, especially when you codify it into law and you say this is something that we are going to sort of replicate across states and make sure it's in place for generations and generations to come. So my notion around urban farming and Freedom Farms is, I hope, an extension of the work that was started with Fannie Lou Hamer. It is, on the one hand, about how to acquire land. And the reason why I'm so interested in working with the faith-based community is because as a nonprofit, as a 501c3, you all actually have a great opportunity to develop land in ways that benefit the community. And then added on to that, how do we talk about environmentalism? How do we talk about climate change? How do we talk about entrepreneurialism? How do we talk about connecting communities and history? And so that's sort of my response to that. I think there's something beautiful and, uniquely abolitionist in it, because we are still in a place where a small percentage owns so much. They own so much of us. And that's the divide that has become increasingly larger and divisive. And so that's just how
Great.
I feel.
I so appreciate that overview. Yeah, I want to build really directly on what you're saying and think about the Jubilee, which I also mentioned, but the Jubilee makes me think about Juneteenth and the Juneteenth commemoration that we're honoring today and tomorrow. Especially because the Jubilee has that famous line of proclaiming liberty throughout the land, ukaratem dror ba'aretz. So that idea that it isn't just that people are free, but that you actually have to proclaim it and let them know that that is significant in itself. With Juneteenth in mind, I'm also conscious of the proposals at the time of the end of the Civil War to think about redistributing land. You know, you mentioned 40 acres, and to take southern farmland and actually distribute land to these newly freed slaves. And, you know, much in the spirit of the Jubilee Year, that everybody then, the society has to be reshuffled so that everybody has some land to work on, to live on. So, you know, in light of our failure to do any of that kind of redistribution or reparation, I wonder if you have ideas about how, like, what kinds of land access can begin to address that historical oversight. What are the land needs now of the African American community?
So I have a little bit of PTSD with the question because, as I shared before, on Thursday, I had to go into Senate Appropriations, and I'm carrying a bill, ACA 3, which is a constitutional amendment that would prohibit involuntary servitude in the state of California. So currently in our state constitution, slavery is prohibited, but involuntary servitude is prohibited with the exception of punishment for a crime. And so I just want to take those last few words out of the Constitution. And the Department of Finance wrote a letter in opposition. And we had 7 bills that we heard in the Senate Appropriations. One is a constitutional amendment that would proclaim the state of California an abortion access state. There were 5 bills that deal with gun restrictions, and then my little old bill. And the Department of Finance was silent on every single one of them except mine. And they said, we know this is a sensitive issue, but we must oppose it because getting rid of this would cost the state too much. So when you talk about freedom, and when you talk about redistribution of land or resources back to folks that had it and it was stolen, it's actually making me think of the work I still have to do to get this thing across the finish line so that voters actually have the option to decide if they want to support this in November. We have been very schizophrenic in how we look at reallocation of resources. So we say, yes, everyone has equal access, but then we do things like redlining, then we have exclusionary covenants, then we push folks into industrial or light industrial communities where the toxicity levels are really high, where the access to certain amenities is really low, where the ability to access green space is almost non-existent. And we say, hey, well, we gave you something, so you should be happy. We create ordinances or we subsidize certain communities at a higher rate than we do others so that developers are not as inclined to go into lower income communities. And so the only businesses that are able to prosper are ones that are not healthy. And then we wonder why so many of the statistics are so bad as it relates to maternal mortality and issues around, healthcare outcomes. And so we have an obligation to address that. One of the things that we're doing at the state level is we're pushing forward a proposal that will put $1 billion into helping folks acquire homes. And so, there are lots of issues about how this would work and if it will work. But I do think there's a beauty in saying we're actually going to put some money into, purchasing a house for you so that you even don't have to worry about a down. We have a program now that's about mortgage relief, and if you're unable to pay your mortgage right now, the state of California will pay it in arrears and then pay it on a go-forward basis if you qualify. The reason why I'm so excited about SB 679 is because it allows for community land trusts and other groups to get into the business of building so that we just are not beholden to predatory developers who really do look at a map and say, where can I get the most bang for my buck? Where can I build? And what they're building is not necessarily what the community needs. We're not doing anything to address the cost of living. We're not doing anything to address the market rate being too high. We're not doing anything that talks about what does social housing look like and how can you create wraparound amenities within the construction of the units that you're building. 1/3 of non-spousal adults are living in shared housing spaces. I think it's equivalent to like a kibbutz or how the we live, we work, all of that. But it shows you that people are yearning to be close to one another. And so, but developers are not building like that. For-profit developers are not. But nonprofit developers, community land trust owners, and communities are really interested in how we can create housing landscapes and environments that are reflective of what people want.
I love what you just did for us there, because we read these ancient texts, we open up our Torah, we think about these radical systems, but we think about them in a very pastoral kind of ancient setting, the land and the fields, but you're right to take that thinking and focus it on questions of real estate, which is also land and property, on questions of development, on questions of mortgage and debt. So that's just, I really appreciate you're making that connection for us. I want to bring Dev into the conversation. You've done a lot of work in thinking about urban farming. Dev is an urban farmer, an organizer, and a teacher of these sorts of topics in our community. So, Dev Brous.
I'm so excited to kind of try to weave between the world that you have shared with us, the frameworks of sabbatical and Jubilee, and the implementation of state legislation to make that ancient Torah relevant today, to make it pragmatic, to make it applicable, to make it real. So it's not just pie in the sky ideas that once upon a time our ancestors practiced and believed in, but it's something that makes sense on the land today. And I think that if I can play a role in this conversation, it might be to try to bridge between the two. Yes. So I'm really excited by the legislation that you've put forward, the abolitionist framework, like the call to end slavery and end human trafficking, this work that you've authored a bill that is this radical, because that's what our Jubilee framework offers as well. Okay? And I'm really excited that you have chosen to put real financial support behind hyper-local urban ag in LA, down in South LA, like that places where community food sovereignty is most in need of funding, most in need of support, not just, language that will get people to think that we want to support it, but you're actually put big money behind Crop Swap LA and really supporting, you did your homework, you're really supporting the best people out there. And that's in line with our sabbatical and Jubilee framework. It's diversifying and creating greater equity between those who have access to land and those who don't. And so this year, I have had my land fallow for the whole year. And let me say, it hasn't been easy, primarily because we're in a historic drought. Yeah. So we have 16 minutes of water per week to grow our food. And that's not easy to work with when you're growing food for a family and for some of the neighbors. And we have to look differently at some of the bigger questions around equitable distribution of resources that are for the commons, like land and like water. And so what I was thinking is that it feels to me almost like you are paving a way as an implementer of the sabbatical and Jubilee framework. We're talking about it, but you're legislating it. You're helping figure out how we can legislate it. And so that's big. That's really, it's really big.
I have to say, I didn't really know how big it was. I'm a stone cold hippie, and in my next life, I am going to be a farmer. I'm going to have all my animals with my Oshkosh overalls, but I believe that it's really hard to have an argument when you hear the sound of water, and I believe that it is really hard to stay angry when your hands are in the soil, because they're just healing properties of both of those elements that make it really hard for you to stay disconnected. But you talked about water. So like, get into that.
I want to get into that because I have a question for you.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't have an answer.
So I would tie this into Juneteenth, and I really love that encapsulation of the Jubilee framework because it's all about that freedom. And water shouldn't be for just the privately owned corporate elite that have access to water in this state. And so my question is kind of like, what would it look like? Our sabbatical year is over in September. We have spent the past year exploring the past 6 years of what's gone well. We've been pausing and reflecting and refining our partnerships and imagining into what a release could look like in the coming 7-year cycle, which begins in September. So I like the thought, and I'm interested in your thought about this. What if a percentage of California agribusiness lands could lie fallow for a year once out of every 7 years and not be farmed in order to regenerate the land, in order to replenish the groundwater supply and the aquifers, in order to permit the farm workers to actually glean the fruits of their labor? We can't sell the food in that 7th year. This doesn't have to be just a spiritual exercise, right? That's the way it's practiced now. It's like, it's voluntary for me. I'm not obligated to practice Shemitah because we live outside of the land of Israel. Even a lot of people in Israel are not practicing the laws of Shemitah. But what if it were something that were mandated? What would it look like if the farm laborers once in every 7 years had no limitations? They would harvest the fruits, they would glean the fields to eradicate food inequity. And that was mandated, that those landowners could not make money that year off of the produce in like a certain percentage of the farms.
So, count me in. I have been, count me in. I've never sat on the ag committee in either the Assembly or the Senate, probably because I'm from LA, but I participate in all of the ag tours that they do, especially when they come down here. I also have been doing a lot of environmental bills, and so one of the bills I'm doing this year is a pilot project on recycling textiles, because we put there's so many fabrics and textiles that are not able to be recycled that we just put in the black bin. And so how do we find ways to do that? So I'm excited. I'm hoping that this bill will get passed. But in looking at all of this and what's in the upstream, I thought, well, what if we put a halt on all production? And I can get down with the year Shemitah if we did it every single year, every 7 years. We are addicted to consumption, we are addicted to production, and we are addicted to waste. And if you could mandate every 7 years where you let it lay fallow, what you will do is help to heal and regenerate, but you will also force community and business and labor to get innovative about what to do during that 7th year and how you can still produce the things you need without actually producing. Look in the garden. Look at the 5 gyres in the ocean. Look at the landfills. Look at the countries who don't want our waste anymore. Look at how we continue to consume. Look at how COVID has pushed us back as it relates to how we use plastics.
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves, how can we flip the switch on this? And I actually believe the one way to do it is to stop production.
For 1 year.
The 1 year. The 1
every
year.
7.
I mean, maybe the thing you still make is like, underwear and socks, but everything else, you say no to, because we also have so much excess. And what would the shared global relationship look like between countries? How do we really sort of leave it on the table as it relates to what we need, what we have, what we store, how we regenerate, how we recycle? I think we've become very lazy in that space. And as a result, Mother Earth is incredibly upset with us. And we do have, I believe, an obligation to make amends with her. And so I would be I'm very excited. I have talked about this idea with some folks, and they look at me crazy. But I think there's something there. And if I was in it with other folks, then maybe we could make some music.
I think if you can make the kind of music that you've been making in the urban ag world and with the waves you're making down here, imagine what could happen throughout the state of California if we were to really drive that to end the abuses of corporate industrial scale farming practices and mandate once every 7 years that all that water is is not to be stopped in the Central Valley.
Yes.
But it's to get down here, it's to go everywhere, it's to go back into the land.
Well, you're paying more for
State
water
drive.
than folks in the Central Valley, even though you're doing farming. So you're still paying commercial rates, but the agribusiness industry carved out years ago a different kind of rate. So the other thing that I'm really interested in is creating a little more equity in that space.
Right. I love this dialogue between two powerful hippie women, self-identified hippies. I would love to, before we close, we have time for a few questions. So I'd love to, if you have questions for the senator. Yeah, Jack. So the question was, have you identified land that the state legislature has jurisdiction over that could be used or repurposed in that way to serve some of these causes?
Like open acres.
So we do have an inventory of underutilized parcels that are owned by the state. Lots of folks are interested in turning those into, affordable housing development. I've decided to actually work locally, starting in my district, and I'm partnering with synagogues and churches and mosques that also own land to say, can you help me identify land where we can make this happen with you? And so I've been working with LA Voice and Pastor Eddie Anderson, and he's put together a proposal. I think he's identified about 40 parcels, 40 communities, and so we're going to try it locally first and then use this as a pilot project to then hopefully expand statewide. She's saying, when are you going to close the Inglewood oil fields? That's the question. And turn it into, so we've been working for years to ban fracking and also to close the Inglewood oil field. Yes, there's lots of opposition, let me tell you. But whatever, haters will get you. There are lots of discussions about how to repurpose that land. And so some folks talk about affordable housing, but also some folks want it to turn into one of the largest state parks. And so I'm open to all things. I certainly feel that it's worth having a series of community engagement forums to find out what people need. And maybe there's a both and. What I do know is it's time to put the dinosaurs to rest and to stop plugging away into those fields. But I know that Culver City has been really aggressive about taking a stand, and I know the small percentage of the fields that is in Culver City is, closing down. And so the goal is to, push this to the state level and really hopefully harness the leverage with LA County to also make a difference there. But there are a few industries that are incredibly toxic and aggressive and mean, and one of those industries is the oil industry, and so we fight them every single day when it comes to bills and ideas like that. What are we doing about the homeless problem? I don't think we have enough time this morning. At the state level, I will say we are really doing our part. We've worked to fund $13 billion more to go to housing, affordable housing and homelessness prevention. We have grants in the budget for encampment resolution for cities to apply if they have humane, compassionate ways that they can resolve their encampment issues. We have a sort of a housing and homelessness accountability dashboard because we know that some cities are skirting their responsibility as it relates to building affordable housing, but we also know that just some of the tax structures in place with the local cities don't really allow them the ability to finance the kind of affordable housing that will really make a difference. At the end of the day, I'm just going to be honest. It is state, local, and county really coming together and saying, okay, what do we do? You know, a few years ago, remember this, LA City and each of the city council districts was supposed to erect shelters. And that was before people said shelters are bad and dangerous. But there was so much pushback from the community. They said, well, we don't want that. And so there's a lot of schizophrenia around what should be done. And I think we also have to have very different kinds of discussions around what compassion and what humane resolutions look like. I certainly don't think it is not humane to allow people to live on the street. There's no part of that that makes sense to me. But we also have to not be so punitive about what kind of housing they should have. I think I've been to Skid Row. I've done projects in Skid Row. I don't know if I've met someone living on Skid Row who is not using a substance. So I don't know that it would make sense to say you have to be substance-free if you're going to get into a unit. I just think we have to be honest about what the goals are. What I will say, going back to your question, is there's a lot being done, and people are frenetically trying to find as many solutions as possible because it is the number one issue that is on people's mind. And every time you walk down the street and you see a homeless person, it is a billboard to all of us of the incompetence of government. And I don't think that those are billboards that can sustain. But it is going to take local, county, state, and federal collaboration, waivers, different kinds of ordinances, certain clauses that will allow for exceptions so that we can fast track things. I mean, there were certain communities that were using CEQA to actually stop the construction of affordable housing for homeless folks. So you have money, you can build, you get stuck in the CEQA abyss, you can't, people are still homeless, and now more people become homeless, and then people say, well, how come you haven't built anything? And you say, well, I can't because then this group over here is fighting the construction. We have not done a very good job of being transparent about all of those challenges so that people can see. But then at the end of the day, I don't think people really care about all that. They just want to see progress. So that was a very long answer to probably a very simple question. But money will not solve the problem. It will also require a change in our thinking about who the homeless are and what they need and what our role has been and how this has created itself.
I think we have time for one last question. Yeah. I think we have time just for one last question. Yeah. Santa Monica Airport might be closed, so wondering if you have any thoughts about how we might use that space for veterans, for various, yeah.
So probably there'll be tons of discussions around, like land mitigation and all of that. But I actually did work with Supervisor Sheila Kuehl with the VA and housing, because there are some facilities on federal property, the armory, the vacant, not being used, and so we actually worked to get some waivers so that we could make those into units so that we could house folks who are unhoused. The federal government, as it relates to veterans, is pretty persnickety. And so you actually have to get waivers so that, VA land can be used to house folks who are not veterans. Right now, federal law says you have to be, or the majority have to be. So that's a federal discussion. And then you also, of course, have to deal with, federal regulations as it relates to airports and that space. But this is the time for us to be as imaginative as possible and to use the weight and the might of the community to say this is a project that works for us. I remember years ago going to meetings around the Santa Monica airport because people were talking about the noise and wanting them to not fly in at certain times and actually really wanting the airport to close. So this is exciting, and we have to step into the gap and actually come up with ideas that makes us for us to be as imaginative as possible and to use the weight and the might of the community to say this is a project that works for us. I remember years ago going to meetings around the Santa Monica airport because people were talking about the noise and wanting them to not fly in at certain times and actually really wanting the airport to close. So this is exciting, and we have to step into the gap and actually come up with ideas that makes us further care about all that. They just want to see progress. So that was a very long answer to probably a very simple question. But money will not solve the problem. It will also require a change in our thinking about who the homeless are and what they need and what our role has been and how this has created. But this is the time for us to be as imaginative as possible and to use the weight and the might of the community to say this is a project that works for us. I remember years ago going to meetings around the Santa Monica airport because people were talking about the noise and wanting them to not fly in at certain times and actually really wanting the airport to close. So this is exciting, and we have to step into the gap and actually come up with ideas that makes us for the community rather than relying on government to make some decisions, because I can tell you, you don't always want that. Our decisions are not always what's best for the folks that are actually living in the community or doing the work in the community.
Senator, thank you so much for being here. It's like, I think Deb said it best. You know, we have a lot of theory, we have a lot of values, we have thousands of years of records of values and theory, but you're in action, you're in doing, you're putting things into practice. And that is what this community is really about, is about taking our values and trying to mobilize them and put them into action. And that's what our Minion Sedek community does. We see ourselves as a theory and values community, but also as an action community. So thanks for inspiring us to do that work. I want to turn it over finally to Dev for a final blessing and close this beautiful gathering.
Oh, yeah. I thought maybe we could all stand up and come close and offer a blessing to the senator, to all of us doing the work of helping to implement the sabbatical and the Jubilee frameworks. Why don't we come in real close? So we hail from this, we hail from a long line of people that have a sacred relationship with land as holy, right? And we're unearthing ways of being back in touch with that kind of intimate stewardship, where we recognize that this is the land that's unceded traditional lands of the Tongva people, and that it's not just a place where we have to walk and drive, it's also a place where we can slow and grow. And so what I thought would be a nice way for us to end today is to just look around the circle and take a breath together and feel into that place where we remember that we have roots underneath our feet. We have a long lineage, a long legacy of people who are deeply connected to the land. And that the idea of galvanizing a Sabbath for the land 1 year out of every 7 in state legislature, like the time has come. So our roots are connected to each other through this experience, this humble but great chance to encounter and have a real dialogue with our leadership in the senator. So let's take a breath together and we'll offer her a blessing. Trailblazing to advance legislation that's mending broken systems requires a lot of energy and a lot of clarity. And so I want to bless you that as you go forward, you find the resilience, that you find the support in faith-based communities that know how much you're putting out into the world to make changes happen, and that you feel the strength and the bolstering of us underneath you, next to you, by your side, cheering you on as you go forward to implement changes on the ground that help us embody our faith practices.
Amen. 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 Great to have you.